To ask questions and be a part of the conversation. So thank you. To be, why does Jewish law exempt women from certain ritual obligations that sensitive, and when people it keeps not working, feels like something is wrong. Was wrong with our information. So I hope now it's working, and hope you could tune back in. Sorry for losing you before, and I hope now that it's going to be better. I hope, thank you for joining us. Thanks for tuning in, and I'm sorry for the disturbance earlier and the stop in the class. But today's topic, the question that we're going to be dealing with is, why does Jewish law exempt women from certain ritual obligations that are obligatory for men? Okay, so that's today's conversation. And I want to preface it by saying and mentioning that this is a subject that is touchy, it's sensitive, and when people feel that they are being discriminated against because of their gender, they tend to react strongly. And it's very more painful. It's even more painful when it's about religion, where religion is supposed to be about love and inspiration and meaning. And when you feel that it may be a discriminatory, that could be very painful and a tough subject to deal with. So it's a sensitive topic we're talking about, but it's something that we can't ignore. And therefore, even though it's a sensitive subject, I hope that we can shed some light on it and try to see it from the Think Jewish perspective, what Judaism thinks about this subject, and why is it that there are different obligations for men and different obligations for women, and many or some of the mitzvot that men are obligated to do, women are exempt from. So again, thank you for tuning in, and if you are tuning in, please let us know in the comments that you're here, that you're watching, and let us know how you're enjoying. We hope that you can be a part of the conversation and things like that. So let us know where you're tuning in from, and I hope that you will enjoy today's class, and thank you for tuning in. So, to dive right into the subject, hey David, back again. I love your theory, and let's explore. Okay? So, having talked about it with many people in the past, it has become increasingly clear to me that many people don't understand where it's coming from. It runs against modern sensitivities, and there are some important premises that Judaism takes for granted, or that Judaism is working from, that aren't necessarily easily or readily understood in our modern society and modern culture. And that makes it difficult for people to understand where Judaism's perspective is coming from. So in order to have a good conversation about this, I want to preface this by a couple of premises that Judaism is coming from that will help us understand this in a much greater way. So one premise in Jewish law or Jewish thinking that differs from secular culture or our modern Western way of thinking and secular culture revolves around rights, whereas Jewish law and philosophy revolves around obligations. We live in a culture that is obsessed with rights. We have human rights, we have women's rights, we have LGBTQ rights, we have minority rights, immigrant rights, animal rights. It's all about rights. And many other kinds of rights, and that's the culture we live in. And that molds the way we think. And I think these rights are actually very important as well. But, and therefore, we end up applying the same concept to spirituality or religion, ritual rights. My right to participate in the way that I feel like I want to. However, Judaism is a system of obligations to God. God created us, according to Jewish way of thinking, to serve Him. And Judaism speaks of what are our obligations to our Creator. So, perhaps we have a hard time wrapping our heads around this kind of concept. But if we want to evaluate and understand Jewish law or appreciate an aspect about Judaism, the only way to be successful in doing so is to understand and appreciate this underlying premise of how Judaism works, is that Judaism is not a religion of rights, it's a religion of obligations. A second premise that I think is important to understand and discuss this topic is that Judaism distinguishes between this discrimination and differentiation. Discrimination is invalid and immoral, and Judaism likes and encourages differentiation, which Judaism believes is valid and is productive. Whereas in our modern society, we often look at them at both as the same. We kind of look at discrimination and differentiation. We conflate the two. Judaism championed the concept of equality since the beginning of time. Judaism, from the Torah comes that the idea that every single person is made in the image of God, and that idea alone has done more than any civilization to champion human dignity. At the same time, Judaism embraces and emphasizes differentiation. Differentiation expresses itself in all elements of the God's world. This world is comprised of three different types of realities: Olam, Shana, and Nefesh. Space, time, and living beings that live in that space and time, so to speak. So there are differentiations in all three of these realms. Just as there are no two locations that are the same, and just like night and day are not the same, So, and just like every single person that exists is decidedly different, there are no two people that are the same. Okay, you are a unique being and there is nobody else in the world that's like you. So too, Jewish law and practice revolves around recognizing those differences and in time, space, and people. In space, there are obligations that are only required in the land of Israel. There are obligations that are only required outside the land of Israel. And besides the practical differences, we also know that Israel in Jewish thinking is a holier place than the rest of the world. There's a certain holiness and godliness that is about Israel that isn't available in the rest of the world. So you see there are differences in places. Okay? And so too in time, there are obligations that pertain specifically to Shabbat that are not obligations on Passover. There are obligations that are specifically for Passover that are not obligations on Sukkot, and so on and so forth. Each time, and these obligations are not obligations that we have during the weekday. Each time has its own set of obligations, and no two times are the same. So there are, and these laws reflect differing flows of divine energy that are available at that time, and that's why there are different requirements spiritually at said times. And so too with people. While the most basic duties of all Jews are the same, to serve God, how we serve God is very different. In Judaism, traditionally we have 3 types of Jews, or even 4 types of Jews. There is the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, which his main function is to do service inside the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur, and also serve in the temple throughout the year. Then there is the Levi'im, the Kohanim, which they have the sacrificial duties and the duties in the temple that other Jews don't have. Then there are the Levites, the Levim, which they have their duties with singing in the temple and guarding the temple. And then you have regular Jews that don't work in the temple. We have regular jobs, and we have agriculture, whatever it is that your job would be. In olden days, a lot of agriculture, shepherding, and things like that. But ultimately, these were different types of living or ways and realities, and each Jew had their own way of serving God. And the Kohen and the Levi didn't have job in agriculture. Their main thing was only to serve in the temple. So you see this concept of that people being different, each one having their own unique way to serve God. In the times of Moses, there was a cousin of Moses. His name was Korach. There's actually a Torah portion that's dedicated to his name. And he protested this system of differences. And he advanced a seemingly sound argument about the virtue of sameness. He argued, and I quote, "All Jews are holy and God is in their midst. Why do you raise yourself above the rest of the Jews?" He made this exact argument. Why are there differences amongst Jews? Aren't we all the same? Aren't we all holy? Shouldn't we all have the same obligation? And what did Moses reply? Moses replied to him, and I quote again, "God assigned boundaries in his world. Are you able to transform morning into evening? That is how possible it is for you to undo his choice of Aharon being the Kohen Gadol and the Kohanim being Kohanim and others being others. God decided these rules. God decided this is how it works. And this is what we do." And I think the second point of differentiation is also linked with our earlier premise about obligation. God set up a system of diversity in practice in order to meet his goals and vision for the world, which we are the crucial part to accomplish this mission. So God wanted Kohanim to accomplish one thing, and he wanted Kohanim to accomplish one thing. He wanted Levites, Levim to accomplish something else. And then he wanted Israelites, the rest of the Jewish people, to accomplish something else. He wanted each person to accomplish and achieve their mission. And if we try to do somebody else's mission, that isn't going to work. Okay? And just like in an army, if the commander tells 2 officers or 2 soldiers to cover and the rest of the soldiers to march forward and to attack, you can't start screaming, well, that's not right. Why don't we all have the same mission? Why don't we all do the same thing? Obviously, the commander is in charge. He has the vision of how to achieve success. And if we follow his vision, we'll get somewhere. If we just start talking about rights of having the same job, then we won't be able to accomplish this goal. So Western thought seems to minimize or seeks to minimize differences in the name of equality. And we want to get away from differences and we want to try to be more equal. But Jewish thought emphasizes differences with the goal of showing how each person, how he or she can contribute and make a difference and fulfill the global divine vision. Therefore, someone that's steeped in the Jewish way of looking at things doesn't ask, what are my rights as a Jew? What are my rights as a Jewish man in observance? What are my rights as a Jewish woman in observance? Rather, the question is, where am I needed in the godly mission? What does God need for me to transform the world and make the world a place that brings out the vision of God? Where is my part in transforming the world and making the world a home for God? So for many of us, this is not how we're used to thinking. We are used to thinking about rights. Like I said, that's how we are raised. That's how Western culture has ingrained our way of thinking. However, when we acknowledge that this framework of thought and how we're supposed to think about it, the discussion of men and women and their respective ritual obligations, it becomes an easier discussion. Again, if coming from a rights-based perspective, it may be very hard to answer these questions, but coming from an obligation perspective of what are my duties to help fulfill the goals of God to make the world a dwelling place for him, then I think these questions start becoming answered in a much greater way. It's much easier to answer these questions, if you will. So that said, let's try to see, before we try to answer the question, let's discuss how many, we're talking about why don't women have the same obligations as men in Judaism? So why does Jewish law exempt women from various ritual obligations that are obligatory for men is our question. And the idea is like this. How many mitzvot do you think are different between men and women? How many more obligations are there for men over women in Judaism that are relevant today in today's day and age? So the truth is that every negative commandment, all the don'ts in Judaism, apply to both men and women equally. It's only in the positive commandments, the do's, that there are some differences. And there are only 14 mitzvot. Out of all of the mitzvot of the Torah, there are only 14 that are obligatory for men, that are not obligatory for women. Okay? So it's not like there's a majority of mitzvot that are only obligated for men and not for women. Women are obligated in the majority of mitzvot. There are 14 that are only obligated, that the only men are obligated to do. The most famous ones would be the mitzvah of tefillin. Binding the tefillin on our arms and heads. Traditionally, in Judaism, it's an obligation for men. It's not an obligation for women. The mitzvah of tzitzit, wearing tzitzit, is an obligation for men, not an obligation for women. The mitzvah of hearing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, it's an obligation on men. It's not an obligation on women. Now, most women probably all women try to hear the shofar, but they don't have the same obligation as men. Okay, these are some of the highlights of mitzvahs that are different. Okay, so it's important to note, first of all, that again, it's not majority of the mitzvot, it's a select few, if you will, that are obligated by men and not by women. So let's look, we need to find what the reason is. Why are women not obligated? Why are they exempt from these mitzvot? So I want to bring an important premise and something we spoke about in previous classes, but I think it's important mentioning again, is that in Judaism, ultimately, we don't necessarily know the reasons why God decided that it should be like this or like that. Ultimately, we believe that God decided so because that's the way he wanted it, and we leave it up and we believe that he knows what he's doing and he knows what he wants from us. And when he asks certain things, that's what he wants. But ultimately, as we discussed in the past, we have an obligation to try to understand our Judaism rationally as much as possible, to try to make sense out of our tradition and to understand why this might be an obligation, why it might not be an obligation. But ultimately, the answers that we give aren't necessarily the sum total of the reasons. It's an exploration of possible reasons and understanding. And ultimately, we understand that God asked for it this way, and therefore, that's what God wanted. Okay? So, let's look in the Mishnah. I'm going to quote from the Mishnah in Kiddushin. And the Mishnah says like this: positive mitzvot that are time contingent, men are obligated, whereas women are exempt. Positive mitzvot that are not time contingent, both men and women are obligated. Okay, so the Mishnah teaches us a principle that women are exempt from positive commandments that become relevant at a particular time or day of the year. For example, the obligation to recite the morning Shema is only obligation for the first few hours of the morning. Therefore, it pertains on first few hours of daylight of the day. So women are exempt from this obligation. On the other hand, for example, the obligation to have a mezuzah on your door is 24/7, and therefore a woman living in a house is obligated in that mitzvah like anybody else. Okay? So this, to the commentators, this concept of women being exempt from mitzvahs that are time bound has given them the room to think and the room to explore and say that the exemption is because the obligation occurs at a certain time. Because Shema must be recited during specific hours, it might generate a conflict with other obligation that a woman has, namely familial obligations, tending to family, to the physical and spiritual needs of their children and families. The core of this rationale is that women have obligations to their families that preclude the possibility for them to have simultaneous obligations. This rationale is premised on the fact that mitzvot are not hobbies. They're not things you do when you have free time, but they're obligations that you must do no matter what. The 10 commandments are 10 commandments and not 10 hobbies. It's not like working out. If I have some free time, well, I guess maybe working out, some people consider a commandment and they do it no matter what. But for most people, you work out when you have some free time, right? When you don't have free time, you don't work out, you skip it. Mitzvahs are not like that. You have to do them all at all times. And therefore, say some of the sages, that God provided women with obligations. And God did not want to give them additional obligations that might get in that way. It wouldn't be right. It would not be fair to give them obligations that would be a contradiction or not allow them to do their other obligations. So therefore, the Torah does not make the demand that they partake in certain obligations. So this rationale, so to speak, highlights the importance in which Jewish law holds caring for and educating a family. And the cry, it kind of goes in the face, so to speak, of the all too common tendency to devalue this important task. In fact, when you ask people what is the secret for Jewish survival, if they're honest and they know the truth about Jewish survival is because of the Jewish family and the Jewish home. Judaism can continue and thrive if there's a strong Jewish home. And the woman is the one who nurtures and creates the Jewish environment in the home. And that is the most important part of Judaism, if you will. And that's kind of the first way of looking at it, if you will, that women have the obligation to their family, to their children, to educate, to nurture spiritually and physically the next generation. And the Torah sees that as a very important task. And therefore, because that's an obligation, the Torah does not want to give extra obligations to a woman that might distract her or get in the way of that. Now, some people, both men and women, might not be very comfortable and have a hard time with that explanation. They reject the premise that women are more than men, have a responsibility to nurture their families. And that explanation also falls flat in the face of that today's day and age. Most women aren't having the 10 to 12 children like maybe people had in the past. And, people have 1 or 2 children. So it might be a couple of years of life, of adult life, 5, 6, 7 years that you have this obligation that gets in the way, and therefore it wouldn't be fair to give you other obligations. But just for 5 to 7 years of your life, you should not have the obligation. You will have 60, 80 years of adulthood. Why is that? Give an exemption for a couple of years while you're raising children, or whatever it is. So some people will say, that doesn't really sit well with me, because it seems like you could have gone around that. So we have to realize that is a challenge that comes from a modern reality. The Torah encourages people to have families as large as possible. Now that sounds like an ambiguous statement, and there's no definitive number, but the reality is that from the Jewish values perspective, Jewish values, the Torah, God wants us to have as large a family as possible, and therefore when it creates its structures, it's creating it based around that. And to be sure, we're not, and I just want to qualify, and I want to explain, that we're not trying to say that a Jewish woman has no identity and no spiritual life other than her family and taking care of her children. The first woman in the Torah has 2 names. There are 2 names for the first woman in the Torah. We call her Isha, which means a person, an individual. And we also call her Chava, which means the mother of all that lives. And a woman, from a Jewish perspective, has these 2 differing realities or personalities or ways of living that are equally important. A woman is an individual on her own, with her own wants, needs, and very much valuable for just that. And then there is a woman as a mother, a nurturer, the creator of life. And this is one of the reasons why Yaakov, right? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, our forefathers, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, our mothers. So when Jacob's wife, Rachel, could not have children, she told Jacob, give me children or else I'm good as dead. If I can't be a mother, then there's no value to my life. And Jacob was very upset with her when he said this. And he basically said to her, there is a special value to you regardless of being a mother. Being a mother isn't the only thing. You could live a very good life, a very wholesome life, a life very devout and connected to God, and a life of great accomplishment without being a mother. Right? So Yaakov was upset with that. Yet, so there is these 2 concepts. There's the woman who she is as her own identity, her own journey, her own personality. And then there's a woman as a mother, as a nurturer. And it's important to know that in Judaism values both of them. And the Jewish model calls for a woman to have a dual role, a chava, being a mother, the mother of all life, and also Isha, an independent being with its own needs, wants, desires, and accomplishments. And this result is the difference of the expectations or obligations that God gives a woman to be able to balance both of those. And therefore, in certain situations, the Torah says, again, in most mitzvot are obligatory to both men and women. But in certain situations, the Torah says that this would get in the way, so to speak, and therefore we're not going to obligate you. In areas of potential conflict with the family life, it runs, again, I know it runs counter to how our current norms, a way of thinking, and I understand that it makes the whole concept difficult, but that's the way the Torah sees it, and that's one perspective. Another perspective that we can say, if you will, is another possible explanation. As much as modern feminism tries to undo the belief that there are substantial differences between the genders, books such as Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus and others have resonated with many people, men and women. Many people do believe that there are existential and emotional differences between men and women, and they have at times very different and divergent outlooks on life. And the concept basically would be, is the same is true from a spiritual perspective. Just like physically and emotionally, intellectually, many people will argue that men and women have a different makeup, different way of looking at life, different way of reacting to things, and so on and so forth. So you could argue that spiritually we also have a different makeup, if you will, and mitzvot, commandment, the obligations are tailored to our spiritual needs. Because men and women have a different spiritual makeup, therefore they have different spiritual diets. And men need certain things to cultivate and connect them to spirituality, and women need different things to cultivate them and connect them to spirituality. Okay? And this is another way of thinking of it, is that the mitzvot are kind of a spiritual diet that God gives us to connect. And because we have different spiritual makeups, therefore we'll have different spiritual needs, obligations, and what's demanded from us. Okay? So these are two different ways of kind of trying to look at this reality and to try to understand the differences and why men and women have different types of obligations in Jewish law and tradition. Okay? So, one last point I want to get to before we wrap up today's class is that we have discussed some possible explanations for women's exemptions from different mitzvot, but I think it's important to return to our original conversation about obligations and differentiation. This much we know for sure, that God placed certain obligations on men, and he does not place those same obligations on women. When we embrace this reality, and that this is the role that God gave us, and this role was ordained by God, there shouldn't and cannot be any feeling of inferiority because you have less obligations. On the contrary, because you know this is what God wanted from you, then that's what's important. And when you do what God wanted from you, you are living up and are as equal or as important or maybe even more important than the one that's doing different things. Because if you're living up to your expectations of what God wants from you, then that's what matters. If you're living up to the obligations that God placed on you, then that's the only thing that matters. As the American feminist Ellen Willis expressed this concept beautifully, and I'll read to you, okay? She wrote this in an article called Beginning to See the Light, okay? And let me read to you this article, this quote from this article. The big lie, and I quote, everything I'm saying now is a quote. The big lie of male supremacy is that women are less than fully human. The basic task of feminism is to expose that lie and fight it on every level. Yet for all my feminist militants, I was, it seemed, secretly afraid that the lie was true, that my humanity was hopelessly at odds with my female sexuality. While the Rebbitzin, a staunch apostle of traditional femininity, did not appear to doubt for one moment that she could be both a woman and a serious person, which was only superficially paradoxical, for if you were absolutely convinced that the Jewish woman's role was ordained by God and that it was every bit as important spiritually as the man's, how could you believe that lie? End quote. And essentially what she's arguing is that the notion of trying to get the male obligations, the notion of trying, of not being satisfied with the role that Judaism, God gave you, is kind of buying into the concept that males are more inherently human or better than women. But if you believe that God gave these roles, and you believe this is ordained by God, then ultimately, if you're doing what God wanted from you, you are the most important. Many people fail to do the jobs and live up to the goals that God set out. And if we're fulfilling those goals, then why believe the lie? Why buy into the story? Why even get into the conversation of whether my role is important or not? God gave you this role. God gave me this role. Whatever role we have, that's the role we have. And when we live our role wholly and completely, that's what makes it worth it. Many women have bought into a lie that what men do is valuable. When was the last time you saw a man trying to light Shabbat candles? When was the last time you saw a man trying to put on a doily when he walks into services? Men are not running to do these things because they do not think that will make them or their devotion more valuable. Just the same, a woman needs to know that you don't need to perform certain mitzvot to be valuable and to express devotion. The way we get our value and the way we express our devotion is specifically and only by doing the things that God asks us to do. And when we fulfill those obligations and we live up, or we try to our best of our ability to live up to those realities or those requests that God makes from us, then we are the most valuable we can ever be. So just to summarize key points, is Western thinking revolves around rights, whereas Jewish law and philosophy revolves around obligations. In addition, while Judaism always championed equality, it emphasizes and thrives on the differentiation of roles and responsibilities. God set up this system of diversity to meet his goal for making the world and transforming the world and bringing his vision to the world. And second point is that Judaism believes and teaches that the unique role of the Jewish woman was ordained by God and every much as important as the man's, and perhaps even more important. That said, that wraps up our class for today. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned something, a perspective. I know this is a lot to mull over and runs contradictory to a lot of ways of how we ingrain thinking in Western society. But again, we're trying to give a think Jewish approach, the way Judaism teaches and what the values are and why certain things done a certain way. and I hope this helped you understand this concept a little bit better. That said, tomorrow's topic is a similar topic, and continuing on today's topic, tomorrow's question we're going to be asking is, why are 10 men required for a minyan? So let's say you have 9 men and 40 women, you don't have a minyan. But if you have 10 men, you have a minyan. Why is it only specifically 10 men that make a minyan? Okay, that will be tomorrow's question. Again, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts, please let us know. If you'd like to ask any questions, please do. Please leave a comment if you're watching and let us know where you're watching from, that you're enjoying. And always, if you want, you can always reach out privately to discuss further. Again, I hope you enjoyed today, as always. And again, I hope to see you tomorrow, God willing, 12:30 or so. Thanks for joining. Otherwise, as we bring our attention to our daily, we bring our attention to our annual summer raffle. We have a summer raffle where it's a fundraiser that brings in much needed funds to help us do the work we do here at Chabad, teaching and caring for students. And during COVID, as you could imagine, it's not an easy time for anybody, especially nonprofits. So we really appreciate now more than ever the support. We really need it to be able to continue. So if you're up to it and you're able to, please join our summer raffle. You can win some awesome prizes. The good thing about this raffle is that all the prizes were donated, so none of your money goes to prizes. It all goes to help Jewish life here at UCF and Valencia. And it's $36 a ticket, and you could win $10,000, 2 tickets to Israel, or cash value of $3,500, $1,000, $500, $360. Those are all prizes, and you could buy raffle tickets at jewishucf.com/raffle. jewishucf.com/raffle. And tomorrow, aside from our daily class, we will also have a cooking show by Chayla. Chayla is going to do a cooking show tomorrow, so tune in. We'll post some information this evening as to when we will do this, what time exactly, but you can tune in tomorrow for a cooking show by Chayla. Okay, have a wonderful day, and